Today we're going to have a look at batch lighting recording and output using either traditional DMX, ArtNet, or streaming ACN via a Pro Commander, Pro I/O device, or the local Showforge timeline. The project we have set up here today has a single stereo audio file, 2 universes of ArtNet recording, and 6 buttons to show status and display on a button panel. Within this recording, we're going to look at how to set up each of these universes for batch recording, as you see on the timeline here, where all of the data for a single universe is contained in a single track and within single envelopes. We're also going to look at how we can individually access DMX channels for interfacing with a MIDI, joystick, game controller, keyboard, or other traditional recording device. Let's get started. First, let's add our ArtNet input directly to our Showforge project. We'll do this under Settings, and then under the Input tab. Currently I've got Universe 0 and Universe 1 set up as ArtNet inputs directly to my Mac. If I click on these, I'll see that Universe 0 is all zeros, Universe 1 is 0, 0, and 1. For more information on Net, Subnet, and Universe, please visit the resources located online here. Basically, these are in 16 universe chunks from the bottom up, with Net being the highest level, Subnet underneath, and then of course Universe from 1 to 16 in all cases. To add an additional input, I'm going to add an ArtNet input and label this as Universe 2. Universe 2 is actually our third universe since we started with a base of 0. To add this input to be available as a recording to a track header, all we need to do is set this up and link it to the universe according to what comes in from my lighting console. Many lighting consoles can do hundreds of universes of DMX, so this is where we would actually set what universe it is listening to from the console. To delete, all we would do is highlight and hit delete again. Because I don't actually need this other universe, we're going to leave just Universe 0 and Universe 1 as active. Under Output, we can set up the DMX, streaming ACN, or ArtNet output in a variety of different ways. As you can see here, we have an initial Pro Commander, and this Pro Commander is a Pro Commander 3. With this, I've set up just the internal IP address that will send Weigl data from the Showforge timeline to the Pro Commander for real-time viewing. This is the same structure that will be used to export this to the microSD card later. As you can see here, I have Universe 0 linked as a single output range from channel 1 to channels 512. Please note this only works for recording sections of data where we've captured an entire universe from an external lighting controller. For individual linking of one-to-one, we would highly recommend using a single track at a time, although there are no restrictions in Showforge preventing you specifically from doing this. However, in our timeline we have Universe 0, which is linked, as you'll see in a moment here, to Universe 0 on the lightboard. Universe 0 here is then linked to the physical DMX 512 output on the Pro Commander 3. Universe 1 is linked to the Pro I/O DMX that is connected over network to the Pro Commander device. Note that what we're viewing and assigning here is linked to the physical outputs of the DMX on the Pro Commander or Pro I/O device listed and linked here. For ArtNet or streaming ACN, this would be done on export in the control.ini file. This would then link the physical universe of DMX on the Pro Commander or Pro I/O devices to an ArtNet or streaming ACN IP address. We'll have a look at this later in terms of export. However, everything is based on the subdevice ID within Weigl, where the universe equals the subdevice ID directly. Additionally, you can set up direct ArtNet devices from the macOS's network port. Here you can see we have local ArtNet Universe 0 and local ArtNet Universe 1. These are set to send to the IP address of 192.168.145.180. While you can send this directly to an ArtNet node or ArtNet Lite, this will not export to the SD card on the Pro Commander device. Typically, this is only used for applications where the Mac will remain, or primarily for previs such as Capture. We'll take a look at that later and actually see this driving a previs application with this data. Now let's have a look at how these link to the actual track and timeline structure. Here you'll notice that we already have some existing data in envelope blocks. I've set this up to have track input as Universe 0. This is coming in over ArtNet from my lighting console. I have my primary output as Universe 0 as linked to the Pro Commander device itself. this again is using the physical output of the DMX jack on the back of the Pro Commander 3, or can be later linked to an ArtNet or streaming ACN output that will be defined in the control.ini. For previous purposes, I also have a mirrored output of local ArtNet 0. This is sending from the network card on my Mac to a program such as Capture, L8, or Light Converse. The same for Universe 1. I have track input 1, primary output is Universe 1 for my DMX Pro I/O, and I have a local ArtNet Universe 1 to be sent out, again, through the Mac OS network card. Now, within the timeline, if I were to set any of these tracks to record in a place where there is no data, so let's scroll down here to the end of the timeline, and I'll go ahead and set my entire group to record. As I roll the timeline, you'll note that it's recording and laying down the entire universe of data as DMX or ArtNet data. This is stored as a block so that it can allow you to move the entire universe of data left, right, copy, paste, trim, or do any other kind of editing functions as a whole. There are, however, some nuances in the ArtNet recording group blocks. First, each of these envelopes does contain 512 channels if that's the range you've specified it for. That is also the maximum per track heading. If you had 16 universes, you'd have 16 tracks, each with 512 channels as a maximum. You could also have less, and you could also divide this by fixture, zone, group implementation, or whatever your project desires. To view individual track data, simply select the envelope and pick the channel you wish to view. This will display within the envelope what channel you're actually looking at the ArtNet data for. Here, I have channel 1 visualized within this envelope, which would be our R in an RGB fixture, and here it's showing the red value going up and down as recorded and will be played back from the timeline. If I want to see any other channel, I simply change that setting within my drop-down menu here to view the channel associated with that ArtNet data. I can perform basic functions with any of these envelopes just as I could with any other Showforge data. I can split, move, group slide, as we looked at earlier, selecting multiple envelopes and moving those in time, copy and paste, and other basic envelope or macro level functions. There are limitations, however, with drawing, and point editing is not available. For drawing, I can insert a drawing envelope in between envelopes and control all 512 or all group channels at one level. This is great for fade outs, fading things up to full, or testing and adjusting, or maintenance shows. It is not really designed for practical applications in show editing. This should be done with this track mode in the lighting console and brought into Showforge as a block of data to be repurposed, trimmed, edited, and then of course exported. We've looked so far at group recording from a lighting console, pixel map software, or other device that would be driving the Showforge data creation. This is very useful for large projects and projects where programming is not inherently done inside of Showforge. However, this is following a lot of the lighting rules. Levels will be held for their last known position and picked up again later when that data continues. If you wanted to do something more traditional to animation, where you're using a keyboard, joystick, game controller, MIDI controller, or otherwise, this is also possible in Showforge. To set this up, we're going to go under the Output tab again, and where we had Universe 0 set up as an entire block of data, we're going to add another output or multiple outputs into our Showforge project. If I select this output here, I can pick my output just like I would in analog or digital and select the number of channels that I want to control. Let's say we had a 3-channel dimmer that we wanted to control all at once. I could do 1 through 3, and those would all be handled as one single output, very similar to our recording. However, if I wanted to do a 1-to-1 ratio, let's set up actually 3 different channels. So I'll call this one red. And just so I don't forget, blue, and single output of green. And this one is going to be set to 1. This one I'll change to 2. And the last one I'll set to 3. So each of these is set to the range, and I messed that one up there, of 1, 2, and 3. Now, if I were to add an individual track, so I'm going to add a new group, and 3 new tracks, and I'm going to fold up my lighting recordings, and here I'm going to set this to red, this to green, and this to blue. And for my inputs, I'll go ahead and just assign a keyboard key to each of these. And we'll do keyboard key Z. And I'm going to select record, roll my timeline. And as you'll notice here, I've created some data just using the standard recording, either from a joystick like I mentioned, or in my case a keyboard. And as I zoom in here, you can see that I've got traditional editing that I can point edit. I can draw within the envelopes, so if I want a little bit of analog data, I can draw a line or a curve, and then of course I can point edit that data as required, and that's actually my RGB value. So this allows kind of the best of both worlds. You can work with a light board at a grand level where you're recording all 512 channels into an easily editable, copy and pastable envelope, or I can create it standard animation style where I have tools such as a curve editing and additional envelope type resources while I'm recording from a keyboard, joystick, game controller, or otherwise. Both of these can coexist in the same timeline. However, you should not have overlapping values sending out to the same channels. Once again, that is not explicitly prohibited. You can still do that in the Showforge setup, but it is not processing things such as highest takes precedence and lowest takes precedence at this time. I've gone back to my save project here because I want to look at 2 additional things. First, let's have a look at setting up a group of fixtures in a little bit more efficient of a manner. Using the project devices capable of exporting DMX ArtNet ACN, I'm going to go under the plus symbol here, and rather than adding a single output for R, G, and B, I'm going to add multiple outputs. I'm going to do this using both dashes and commas, so I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3, and then I'm going to do 4 through 20. Under this, I'm going to say RGB fixture channel. And what I'm going to do is create sort of a parent channel here that we can set as our red, green, and blue parent outputs. This will allow us to just have 3 tracks for red, green, and blue, even though we may have 5, 6, 7, 8 fixtures. It makes programming much more efficient and doesn't require you setting up the same tracks and having all that data to deal with, particularly when it comes down to editing. So now that I've got those set up, I'm going to go back to my track mode, and I'm going to fold all these up, and I'm going to add a new group. And in this group, I'm going to call this RGB fixtures, and I'm going to set up 3 tracks. With these 3 tracks, I'm going to set an output for red, green, and blue, respectively. However, now under here, I can set up as many outputs as I want as mirrored relationships to give this that parent-child relationship. So if I set this to 4, and then, of course, to 7, and 10, and so forth down the line, I've got these outputs that are all going to follow or mirror that primary red output. This means I don't have to keep programming the same channels over and over again. Under this track now, I have the ability to create this data, so I can use a line to create a sine wave or square wave. I can do point editing, or I can do this straight line tool if I want something that's a little bit more linear. Of course, the track is currently set to off, but we can set this to play, live, latch, or whatever. With this, though, you'll see there's a couple things that are happening. Number one, as I play the track, this data is going to output to the tracks that were all listed in this track heading. So as this is at 60%, these red fixtures are all following that output. The other thing I want to look at here in terms of how lighting is going to respond is that, remember, this is not like a light board. You are actually dealing with live data. You're not dealing with a Q-to-Q scenario. So every frame of data in Showforge is going to have an output relationship to it. Under here, if I create similar data to show me the synchronization between R, G, and B, notice I've got these different levels here, and I'm going to go and I'm going to change that whole group into play. This curve here, where there actually is no data, represents almost like a ramp or a fade time between one cue and another. However, note that everything in Showforge is based off linear interpolation, and it is not going to actually crossfade like you'd have a Lightboard output playback setup. This is actually better for motion control and can give you more of a smooth or linear ramp. So if I were to pick the slide tool, group slide tool, and select all three of these, as I move these back and forth, you'll notice here, oops, and I split that envelope quickly there. You'll notice that this ramp between these two envelopes is very similar to your fade time on a Lightboard. Okay, I've gone back again to my save project so we can take a look at one last thing, and that's the relationship of analog and digital inputs as they go to outputs either on a Weigl device, that is a contact closure, or on a non-dim or dimmer circuit in the lighting world. So I'm going to use these button lights as examples. These are linked to a digital output on the Pro Commander. So inherently, they are a digital type output. Now, if I turn on my point editing mode or my drawing mode, you're going to see this dashed line that goes right in the middle of the screen. So if I have a line here, notice that if I were to create my tool for the line draw, that I have off and on basically above or below those lines. So if I go up, great, that's an on. If I go down, that's an off, an on, and off, and on, and off, and on, and you'll see that those data points are represented as such. The same thing would happen if I did a curve here and did like a sine wave. It's going to translate that into an on and off status. Well, what happens if I go back and I have a non-dim circuit that I now want to make a dimmer circuit? Does that data get lost? Does it get changed? The short answer is if I change this even to one of my batch outputs that is analog, this entire universe, universe 1, is going to be responding to that data now in an analog fashion. In Showforge, our data is inherently stored at a 16-bit output level as an analog track. The data interpretation of above 50% or below 50% is done based on the output only. You'll also notice this in the console mode here, that any of the digital outputs are represented as an on-off state with a red or green light, and the analog outputs are the range there, which is the VU style meter. This is tied to the output side of things, not the input side. So your input is always stored as analog, even if we are processing it as digital. Similarly, if I were to go under inputs and I have an analog input, I'm going to go ahead and capture now a MIDI console button here that's going up and down, and I'm going to hit save and close. Of course, I could scale that. I could do all of my other relationship type inputs and outputs for settings there in Showforge, but I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to go and actually delete a few of these envelopes here, and you'll notice how things are adjusting. And I'm going to do a short recording on this track. So I'm going to set this to record, and I'm going to double check that I have MIDI and I have Universe 1. So here, theoretically, I'm going to be recording the entire universe of DMX at this punch-in point, and this should respond to the MIDI slider. And you'll see here that this data is going up and down as I move my slider. Now, if I stop here, it's going to create that ramp like we talked about from the previous envelope to the next envelope. I'll go ahead and move this group back to play. And as I drag this, you'll notice that my visual fade time from the previous envelope to the next envelope is represented here by this line. Inside of the envelope, unless I actually went in and modified some of these points, that data is real time. It's going to be going from one point to another with a smooth linear interpolation. So just for the sake of example, I'm just going to move some of these data points down, kind of do like a fade here to get some of them below 50%. And then, of course, I want to get some of them above 50%. Now, I'm going to change that universe 0 back to a digital output, and let's see what happens here. So those data points still exist. They don't go away. Now, I'm in point editing mode, so I'm going to turn that off because that's a little bit confusing. But if I turn that off, notice that the only points that I had that were above 50% were represented by this block. The remainder of those points do not go away. They're still there in the track edit. In fact, I can even turn on point editing to say, okay, where are those points below 50%? Where are those points above 50%? And as I drag some of those points above 50%, it's going to work like a relay or a non-dim circuit in the lighting world. So again, we are always storing that data as 50% is on, lower than 50% is off. So hopefully that and some of this track manipulation can help you create a show if you need to with the animation style tools that we have in Showforge. At a certain point, you're always going to go to external software for pixel mapping or full lightboard creation, but certainly for some basic RGB fixtures, you're going to have a lot of options here in Showforge directly. Note that there are a lot of other predefined lighting effects that are coming in to our library so that you would be able to do some more basic things without actually having to use a physical input device, but you do have plenty of tools here at the moment for either creating data from tools on your machine or an external lighting board or software. Once the creative part of your project is done and you're happy with the results as they look in the field, you're ready to export to the microSD card. There's a lot of values that can also be applied in the control.ini, which can either be done externally in things like VS Code, Notepad, etc., or within the Showforge project itself. These things can help limit values, map to ArtNet or streaming ACN network outputs, or define startup positions and values outside of a running timeline. For more information on these, please see additional training videos and documentation on the control.ini and the Weigl WEM script language. Again, here you'll see some things that set the max value. So this is limiting the overall scale. It's kind of like a clamp or parking a dimmer channel or things like that within the lighting world. And again, mapping a ArtNet universe or virtualizing that physical output on the Pro I/O or Pro Commander to a DMX universe elsewhere. So all these things are defined once in the control.ini. They're exported with your show and would apply globally to each individual show. If you are doing an ArtNet or streaming ACN show, you can do this in Configurator. You could also do it in the control.ini, but we do recommend hard coding it into your show as we're showing here, so that when you update the creative portions of things, ArtNet and streaming ACN are reflected accordingly in this INI. These aren't also one-to-one. They can be soft patched, so Weigl Universe 1 or Pro I/O 1 can be mapped to the related ArtNet Universe 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. It's a virtual soft patch for what DMX Universe would go to what ArtNet or streaming ACN output. And if you have any additional questions, please contact us at support@weiglcontrols.com.